Monday, November 17, 2025, was supposed to be a quiet, routine day in the Southern District of New York. The courthouse, as it always was on Mondays, should have been still. Courtrooms, usually teeming with attorneys, defendants, and spectators, should have been locked tight, waiting for the week's cases to begin on Tuesday. But not today. Not this Monday. Today, the silence was shattered. The courthouse doors, which should have remained shut, were flung open in response to an emergency so severe it couldn't wait until the usual business hours. The bustling, hushed halls of Manhattan's federal courthouse, usually devoid of activity on a Monday morning, became a flurry of urgent movement. The calm atmosphere that permeated the hallways for years was pierced by a single, explosive event: the discovery of an alcohol bottle inside a prison cell. And not just any prison, Fort Dix, a maximum security facility where the man involved was no stranger to the law. This was the day Diddy faced consequences more severe than he ever imagined. The news of the bottle, found in his cell in the early hours of November 7th, spread like wildfire. The world had been watching Diddy closely, ever since his high-profile case began earlier that year. The shock that rippled through the system was not just about the violation itself, but about what it represented: a fatal crack in his already fractured empire. This was not just another prison infraction. This was the catalyst that might undo everything he had tried to rebuild. Fort Dix on that fateful night began as any other. The facility was quiet, its cells and hallways dimly lit by the usual cold, artificial lights. Officers on the night shift carried out their rounds as they had 1,000 times before, checking cells, performing routine inspections, and reporting to their superiors. It was another night of monotonous routine. That is, until 2:17 a.m. when the discovery was made. One correctional officer, tasked with a standard pillow check in Diddy's cell, noticed something unusual. Beneath the pillow, placed with a quiet yet deliberate care, was a small metal-capped bottle. The officer froze. His eyes scanned the bottle for any distinguishing marks or signs of tampering, but there was no mistake. It was alcohol. In a federal maximum security facility, this was not just an infraction. It was a violation so grave that it could bring down empires. The officer stood motionless for a moment, his mind racing to comprehend what he was seeing. How had it gotten there? How had something so forbidden, something that could shake the foundations of the entire system, found its way into Diddy's cell? He didn't speak. He couldn't. It felt like time itself had stopped as the implications settled in. This was not a simple mistake. This was a catastrophic breach of federal law. He carefully lifted the bottle, his hand trembling, and called for backup. "Come, the officer said, his voice steady, but it carried the weight of the discovery. "Get up." Diddy, waking slowly, turned toward the officer. His eyes immediately locked onto the bottle in the officer's hand, and in that instant he knew. There was no argument, no defense. The violation wasn't just a small slip. It was an act that had the power to undo everything: his sentence, his future, his hopes of ever leaving prison alive. The officer called in the discovery, and within moments the facility erupted into chaos, though it was all contained behind closed doors. Alarms didn't sound, but every procedure, every protocol was set into motion with cold precision. The discovery of contraband, particularly alcohol, was considered a federal offense that was not to be taken lightly. This was the kind of violation that made everything else irrelevant. It wasn't just a minor rule break. It was a direct challenge to the very authority of the institution. By the time the violation report was finished, it had already made its way to the most important man in the process: Judge Arun Subramanian. The judge, who had already shown leniency on October 3rd by sentencing Diddy to just 50 months in prison despite the prosecution's demand for over a decade, was now faced with a fresh crisis: the violation of federal rules inside a maximum security facility. The courthouse, usually silent on Mondays, was suddenly abuzz with reporters and photographers who had gathered outside. News trucks parked across the street, while microphones began to shake in the cold November wind. Rumors spread like wildfire, and whispers of Diddy's downfall echoed from one legal analyst to another. He did it again. He destroyed his own sentence. Inside the prison, meanwhile, the investigation intensified. Surveillance footage was replayed over and over again, each second scrutinized for clues. At first, the footage didn't offer clear answers. At 1:58 a.m., a shadow passed near the cell. By 2:03 a.m., a figure appeared near the door, but it was not enough to identify anyone. It wasn't until 2:17 a.m. when the bottle was discovered that the implications hit hard. The inconsistencies in the movement logs became more glaring. Doors that should have been logged were absent. A motion sensor that tripped went unreported. It was clear that someone somehow had slipped the bottle into Diddy's cell. But it wasn't just a case of a simple rule break. It was a failure of the system, a crack in the very foundation of federal authority. The questions began to mount. How had it happened? Who was responsible? And why was the bottle found under Diddy's pillow? By the time the violation report was transmitted to Judge Subramanian, the courthouse was on high alert. A hearing was scheduled for that very Monday. Judge Subramanian had already delivered a final verdict back in October, but this new development changed everything. No longer was the court concerned with Diddy's original sentence. Now, the question was whether Diddy would ever leave prison again. Inside the courtroom, every step reverberated with significance. The moment Diddy entered the courtroom, chains clinking softly, the room seemed to freeze. The air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just another day in court. This was the reckoning. Diddy wasn't here to argue for a reduced sentence anymore. He was here to defend himself against the harshest consequences imaginable. As Diddy sat down at the defense table, he realized that this was the end of the line. His empire, his entire existence outside of prison had crumbled. The alcohol bottle, so small, so simple, had destroyed everything he had worked for. It wasn't just a violation, it was a direct challenge to the court's authority and to the integrity of the federal prison system. And now, he was left to face the consequences. The courtroom grew silent as the judge entered. His presence was commanding, almost suffocating in its seriousness. Judge Subramanian's face gave nothing away, no emotion, no hint of sympathy. He held the violation report in his hands, flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning the evidence carefully. The prosecutor wasted no time, presenting the findings of the Bureau of Prisons and the severity of the violation. The alcohol bottle was placed on the table, gleaming under the harsh lights of the courtroom, an almost mocking reminder of how something so small could bring an entire life crashing down. Diddy's defense lawyer, Mark Agnafilo, stood up, desperately trying to salvage what was left. He pleaded with the judge to consider the context. Diddy was under immense emotional distress, adjusting to a life behind bars, dealing with the constant media pressure. But Judge Subramanian was unmoved. His words were sharp, dismissing the defense's attempts at mitigation. The judge had already made up his mind. Diddy's silence when confronted with the bottle, his failure to explain how it came to be in his possession, sealed his fate. As the prosecution pushed for the maximum penalty, Diddy's mind raced. He could barely breathe as the judge's voice cut through the room. This court finds that your violation justifies a complete reevaluation of your sentence. The words landed like a hammer, and Diddy's heart sank. The room erupted into whispers as the judge continued, delivering the final blow. In light of your violation, I hereby vacate your original sentence of 50 months. You are now sentenced to life imprisonment. The courtroom gasped. Diddy's body shook violently, tears streaming down his face. He collapsed forward, unable to hold himself up any longer. His sobs filled the room, the weight of his fate crushing him from every side. His empire was gone. His freedom was gone. The life he had known was over. And as the marshals pulled him from the courtroom, dragging him toward his new reality, Diddy's cries echoed through the halls, a stark reminder of how far one man's mistakes could take him. In that moment, Sean Diddy Combs lost everything. The doors that had once seemed like a barrier to his freedom were now closing forever, and there was no escape.